Imagine waking up one morning, and the sun never rises again. The sky stays dark, the air gets cold, plants wither, animals vanish, and your entire species teeters on the edge of extinction. This isn't a movie plot. It actually happened 74 years ago. This is the story of the Toba supervolcano, most violent eruption in the last 2 million years. An event so catastrophic, it blacked out the sun, froze the planet, and nearly wiped out every single human on Earth. But here's the twist. We didn't just survive. We adapted. We evolved. And in that darkness, we became who we are today. In this video, we're diving deep into the volcanic apocalypse that almost erased us. We're talking ash clouds that reached the poles, a global temperature drop of 15 degrees, and a sunless world that lasted years. Forget Ice Age. This was hell, frozen over. But this isn't just about rocks and lava. It's about our ancestors, their struggles, and the raw, brutal reality of surviving the unthinkable. Here's what you're about to witness. How it happened. We'll break down the Toba explosion itself, where it struck, what it unleashed, and why it was unlike anything the Earth has seen before or since. Why the sun disappeared. The science behind the volcanic winter that followed ash in the stratosphere, sunlight blocked out, global collapse. What it did to humans. How our species, just small scattered tribes at the time, faced starvation, freezing, and mass extinction. The survivors. We'll explore the tiny human pockets that clung to life, hiding in caves, surviving off shellfish, mastering fire, and forming the first sparks of culture and belief. The aftermath. We'll uncover how this apocalyptic event reshaped our DNA, sharpened our minds, and rewired our brains for cooperation, creativity, and connection. The other species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus. Did they fall because of this? Did we rise because of it? The legacy. And finally, we'll connect the dots between this dark chapter and the ancient myths that came later: sun gods, great floods, sky demons. Because when the sun disappears for years, you don't forget it. You pass the story down forever. This isn't just history. It's humanity's origin story under fire. So sit tight. Because what happened 74 years ago didn't just shake the Earth. It shaped you. No one saw it coming. There were no seismographs, no satellites, no scientists warning us on live streams. Just a quiet island in what we now call Sumatra, breathing beneath the surface. A year before everything changed, the world was wild and untamed. Dense jungles wrapped around ancient rivers. Megafauna roamed freely: giant elephants, saber-toothed cats, rhinos the size of tanks. The air was humid, the sun golden. Seasons rolled slowly. Life had a rhythm. But beneath it all, something was stirring. Deep under the earth, a magma chamber had been building pressure for tens of thousands of years. A sleeping monster. A geological time bomb. But up top, humans had no clue. We were scattered small tribes of Homo sapiens, barely surviving. No nations, no cities, just family clans, hunting, foraging, and telling stories by firelight. In the heart of Africa, some of us lived along coastlines, relying on shellfish, fire, and community. In Asia, others tracked game through dense forest. Further north, our cousins the Neanderthals roamed. Cold, harsh terrain, already adapted to chill and snow. The world was wild but stable. Volcanoes had erupted before. Storms had come and gone. But this wasn't just another eruption. It was the Earth exhaling with the force of 1,000 nuclear bombs. Pacing shift, slow to ominous. Let's talk pressure. Imagine molten rock thick, burning, and ancient pressing against stone walls for centuries. Kilometers underground, it's expanding, stretching, boiling. The Earth's crust, cracking like old leather. Animals in the region may have sensed it first. Sudden migrations, strange weather, birds going quiet. But for the early humans nearby, there were no signs, no reason to panic. They cooked their meals, slept under stars, taught their children how to track footprints in the mud, and all the while, just beneath their feet, the clock was ticking. Transition line, into the explosion. What happened next would change the planet forever. The Earth didn't just erupt, it detonated, and the world they knew would vanish in a matter of hours. This was the beginning of the end. We take you into the blast, moment by moment. The roar, the ash, the fire that turned day into eternal night. This isn't imagination. This is what the worst day in Earth's history actually looked like. It started with a sound, not thunder, not a storm. A deep, rolling growl from the belly of the Earth. At first, the animals reacted. Birds launched into the air in frantic waves. Monkeys screamed. Herds of ancient elephants stampeded away from the mountain. But the humans? They just stared, because the mountain wasn't supposed to move. And then it did. The Earth heaved. A tremor strong enough to knock people off their feet rolled across the land. Cracks split the ground like lightning across the soil. Water rippled, trees swayed and snapped. The sky began to dim. But it wasn't nightfall. It was ash. Thunderbolts. Just for a moment, the world held its breath. And that's when it blew. The Toba supervolcano didn't just erupt. It detonated with the force of nearly 1 million megatons. The entire mountaintop exploded, rock, magma, and gas, launching into the stratosphere at supersonic speeds. A column of fire, 50 kilometers high, punched into the sky like Earth was stabbing the heavens. Ash, molten glass, and razor-sharp rock blasted out in every direction, turning the air itself into a weapon. People within 1,000 kilometers were instantly incinerated. No screams. Just lightened, then nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The real killer came after. Ash didn't just fall. It poured. Gray snow that burned on contact, filling lungs and blinding eyes. It covered rivers, forests, animal sentiment, entire ecosystems in hours. Lightning danced across the ash cloud. Tsunamis tore across coastlines. Acid rain fell for days. Across the world, sunlight faded. Not slowly, violently. The ash cloud wrapped the planet in a choking veil, blocking the sun like curtains over a dying fire. In Africa, the skies dimmed. In India, darkness fell at noon. Even Antarctica saw the shift. People ran, but there was nowhere to go. Crops failed within weeks. The air cooled. The volcanic winter had begun. This was the day the sun disappeared. Not by prophecy, by pressure, fire, and time. What started in Sumatra would shake every corner of Earth. And the humans who survived it wouldn't do so by accident. The blast was over. But Earth wasn't healing. It was breaking. Ash rose higher and higher, piercing the stratosphere, where winds carried it across continents not days later, but within hours. India, buried. China, darkened. Africa, choking. Europe, already cooling. And the poles? Even they weren't safe. You have to understand, this wasn't just dirt falling from the sky. This was chemical warfare from the planet itself. The ash wasn't alone. Sulfur dioxide atoms of it mixed with water vapor high in the atmosphere, forming a thick layer of sulfuric acid haze, the kind that blocks sunlight like a blackout curtain. The result? Global temperatures dropped by up to 15 degrees Celsius, 59 degrees Celsius. In less than a year, there was no sunrise, no warmth, no seasons, just a cold eternal twilight. What had been lush rainforests turned into skeletal graveyards. What had been grasslands became frostbitten deserts. The ecosystem crashed. Plants withered. Trees stopped growing. Entire food chains collapsed like dominoes. Megafauna, those massive beasts that once ruled, starved or froze. The predators that hunted them, gone too. Even scavengers couldn't survive. Nothing left to eat, nothing left to breathe. It wasn't just hunger, it was suffocation. Ash-clogged lungs turned rivers into sludge, blanketed the ground so thick it blocked seeds from sprouting. It wasn't a season, it was a dead age. And humanity? We didn't thrive. We barely hung on. Tribes that had once roamed freely were now trapped, clinging to scraps of warmth, hiding from wind and ash in caves and rock shelters. Fire became life, not just for heat, but for hope. Because when the sky won't shine, when the sun is gone, and the cold eats everything, you worship the flame. This wasn't just environmental collapse. It was psychological warfare on every species. Fear, isolation, madness. The world had ended, and it wasn't coming back anytime soon. Ash filled the sky, the sun was gone, and the world turned cold fast. Crops didn't just fail, they vanished. Grains, berries, edible roots wiped out. Animals either starved, fled, or froze. Entire food webs collapsed in a matter of weeks. And early humans, they were left with nothing. No harvests, no game, no clue when or if the sun would ever rise again. In East Africa, the lakes dropped, rivers ran dry. Rain became a stranger. Drought slammed the continent with unforgiving force. In other places, it was the opposite. Flash freezes, unseasonal storms, icy winds tearing across landscapes that had never known cold. The earth wasn't just dangerous, no, it was hostile. This is where it gets raw. No civilization, no backup plan, only instinct, fire, and desperation. Small human groups did the only thing they could. They vanished. Into caves, into forests, into coastal edges where the sea still offered scraps of life. South Africa, Blombos Cave. This wasn't just shelter. This was salvation. In this cave, some of the earliest Homo sapiens survived by turning to the ocean. Not farming, not hunting, foraging. Shellfish, seaweed, crabs. They learned to live off tidal rhythms. When the land betrayed them, the sea became their last ally. And that diet? It kept them alive when millions were dying. Across the rest of the world, survival looked more brutal. Inland, humans began moving at night. Ash storms made daytime lethal. They hunted in silence, shared everything, clung to fire like it was a god. And maybe that's exactly what it became. This is where belief systems sparked. Because when the sun disappears, when you don't know if tomorrow even exists, you start telling stories. You pray. You fear the sky. You worship the flame. Communities shrank to tight-knit tribes. No more strangers. If you were alive, you were family. You fought for each other. You buried your dead. You passed down stories of light, of warmth, of a world that once was. That wasn't just survival. That was the birth of culture. Most didn't make it, but those who did, they didn't just live, they adapted. And that's where the next part of this story explodes wide open. We were never meant to survive this. Not as a species, not as a future. After the eruption, Earth wasn't just dark. It was empty. No cities, no crops, no noise except wind, water, and the occasional whisper of life clinging to edges. And in this silence, something terrifying happened. We disappeared. Not metaphorically, literally. Genetic evidence tells us that, at our lowest point, the entire human species was reduced to as few as 30 individuals. Some say 10 max, but many estimates go lower. That's the population of a small town, on a planet meant for billions. Think about that. You, me, everyone we've ever known, descended from a few thousand survivors. The rest? Gone. Their lineages erased like chalk in the rain. This is what scientists call a population bottleneck. Imagine a funnel. At the top, diverse, sprawling genetic variation. Then something catastrophic happens, like a supervolcano, and only a few genes make it through to the other side. That's what Toba did to us. It squeezed humanity into a genetic chokehold so tight, it left a permanent mark in our DNA. Every human alive today carries the echo of this extinction. Traces of it are found in mitochondrial DNA's maternal line, passed from mother to child, unchanged for millennia. It's not just theory. It's written inside us. Evidence of shared ancestry, fewer mutations, tighter gene clusters. We were cornered, almost erased. But somehow, we didn't just bounce back. We came out stronger. Because pressure does something wild to evolution. It accelerates it. When survival hangs by a thread, only the most adaptable minds, bodies, and behaviors make it through. That means sharper brains, better memory, improved communication, more cooperation. The bottleneck didn't just cut us down, it refined us. It forced us to get smarter, faster, more connected. Because the isolated tribes who couldn't adapt, they vanished. And here's the mind-bending part. This genetic reset may be why humans eventually outcompeted Neanderthals, Denisovans, and everyone else. We weren't the strongest, but we were forged in crisis. And crisis makes killer-sore creators. We became both. So next time you look around at the world, the tech, the languages, the art, the science, just know, it almost didn't happen. We came within inches of silence. We weren't alone. 74 years ago, Earth was a crowded stage. Not with cities, but with species. Cousins, competitors, and cohabitants. Each trying to claim a place in a brutal world. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus. All alive, all adapted, all on the clock. Then Toba exploded and the rules changed. Let's start with the Neanderthals. Thick-boned, cold-resistant. They had Europe. They had tools. They had fire. But they didn't have time. While we hid in coastal caves, they faced a frozen hell. Europe, already cold, turned lethal. Toba didn't just lower the temperature, it plunged it. Crops failed. Game migrated or died. Neanderthals were strong, but strength means nothing when the food chain shatters. They had survived ice ages before. But this wasn't just an ice age. This was a shock freeze, with skies so dark, seasons stopped making sense. And when conditions finally settled, we showed up. Smarter, more adaptable, more connected. Toba didn't wipe them out overnight, but it weakened them, set the stage for their slow extinction just 30 years later. Now zoom further east, Homo erectus. These were the veterans. They'd been around for over 1 million years, longer than anyone. Their territory, Southeast Asia ground zero for Toba's rage. They didn't stand a chance. Volcanic ash, firestorms, sulfur, clouds, their entire habitat was ground to dust. And unlike sapiens, they lacked the cognitive flexibility to flee, adapt, or innovate quickly. Toba didn't just challenge them, it ended them. This may have been their final blow, a legacy erased by fire and silence. Then we have the Denisovans, the mysterious ghosts of Siberia. Not much is known, but we know they were there deep in the east, adapted to high altitudes and colder climates. That helped, but not enough. Toba didn't discriminate. Even the most remote regions caught the edge of the fallout. And if they survived the eruption, the post-eruption famine and freeze would have thinned them to the brink. They may have persisted longer than others, but the clock was ticking. Today, they live on only in fragments, tiny slivers of DNA found in Tibetans, Melanesians, and Aboriginal Australians. Ghosts in our genome. Toba was the great equalizer. It didn't matter who you were, hunter or forager, genius or brute. If you couldn't adapt fast enough, you were erased. Homo sapiens? We were fragile too, but we were different. We didn't just survive. We evolved through it. When Toba blew, it wasn't just a volcano. It was a planetary reset button. The blast alone killed everything in its path, scorching forests, vaporizing valleys, choking rivers with molten rock and ash. But the real death came later. Ash. Cold. Dark. It spread across continents like a slow-moving plague. In Asia, where the eruption hit hardest, entire ecosystems collapsed. Rainforests in Southeast Asia didn't just get dusted, they disintegrated. The weight of the ash crushed the canopy. Photosynthesis stopped. Plants withered, and animals starved. From the tiniest insects to massive beasts, the food chain broke at every level. Herbivores had nothing to graze. Carnivores had nothing to hunt. It was a chain reaction of slow, silent extinction. In Africa, the picture was different, but no less brutal. The skies dimmed. Rainfall patterns shattered. Water sources dried up or flooded in erratic bursts. Mega herbivores like giant elephants, hippos, and rhinos, gone in huge numbers. They needed massive amounts of food daily, and when that food vanished, so did they. Predators like lions and saber-toothed cats followed. Toba didn't just kill animals. It disconnected the ecosystem. No prey, no predators. No forests equals no homes. No sun equals no chance. Meanwhile, up north, the Ice Age got turbocharged. Glaciers advanced. Tundras spread. Animals used to cold adapted, but Toba took it too far. Species like woolly mammoths, steppe bison, and giant deer were forced into tighter and tighter corners of livable land. Those that couldn't migrate fast enough, game over. Bird migrations derailed. Insects vanished. Reptiles froze. Amphibians dried out. Even the oceans, normally a refuge, aren't safe. The shift in sunlight and atmosphere altered sea temperatures and currents, disrupting marine life worldwide. From coral reefs to open water hunters, marine food chains began to buckle. This wasn't extinction like a meteor. It was slow-motion biological collapse. Over years, even decades. And here's the wildest part. Some animals did adapt, those small, flexible, and opportunistic. Rodents, birds of prey, scavengers, and humans. Because when the megafauna died out, it was the age of the small, clever survivors. The world was emptied of giant sand, filled with shadows. When the skies finally cleared 6 to 10 years later, Earth didn't recognize itself. New landscapes, new rules, new players. And the stage was finally set for humans to rise. Imagine stepping outside for the first time in years and realizing the world you knew no longer exists. No birdsong, no familiar plants, no herds, just silence, smoke, and strange new land beneath your feet. That's what the Toba survivors faced. But here's the twist. That silence, it didn't break them. It awakened them. In the aftermath of the eruption, small human bands emerged from caves, shelters, river valleys, wherever they'd clung to life. They were weaker, fewer, hungrier, but they were ready. Because surviving Toba wasn't just luck, it was adaptation. And once the skies cleared, they didn't waste a second. The world was a blank slate. Landscapes reshaped by ash and erosion. Forests gone. Old animal paths erased. New rivers carved by floods. For the first time in human history, we had to explore again. Nomadic instincts kicked in. Small clans began to move. First cautiously, then constantly. This was the spark of something bigger than survival. Migration. From Africa to the Middle East. From Asia into Europe. From valleys into highlands. And from rivers to coastlines. The trauma of Toba shattered stagnation. It broke barriers. And with that came new encounters. New terrains. New prey. New threats. New ideas. Every step into the unknown rewired us. Every challenge pushed us to create, adapt, believe. And as groups moved and mingled, something incredible happened. They started to remember. Not with writing, not with books, but with story. They passed on what they'd seen: darkness, cold, fire from the sky. Parents whispered it to children. Elders turned it into ritual. And those stories became culture. Around shared trauma, they built new myths, new rules, new identities. From that ash came tribes. From that silence came language. From that struggle came us. Toba didn't just burn the world. It cleared the path. And those who emerged from the dark didn't just reclaim the earth. They started redesigning it. Fire wasn't just warmth anymore, was sacred. The sun wasn't just light, it was a god reborn. Each meal, each hunt, each sunrise became a celebration of survival. It's no stretch to say Toba kick-started civilization. Not in cities or temples, but in the minds of those few who dared to hope again. Before temples, before scripture, there was fear and fire. After Toba, survivors didn't just rebuild, they started looking up. What was that thing that swallowed the sun? Why did the sky cry ash? Why did the earth shake like it was alive? And most importantly, how do we stop it from happening again? The first answer was fire. Fire meant warmth. Fire meant food. Fire meant life. It was the only light in a world swallowed by darkness. No wonder it became the center of early rituals. Small clans huddled around flames, whispering stories of the day the sun disappeared. They didn't have science. They had memory. And memory turned into meaning. They began to believe. Maybe the fire was a gift from something greater. Maybe it was a message. Maybe the sky was angry, or mourning, or warning them. This is where the first myths were born. Not written, not formal, but felt deep in the bones. Imagine an elder crouched by the flames in a cave near the South African coast. The children are silent. Outside, the wind still howls, and shadows stretch across the ash-covered land. The elder speaks. There was a time when the sky was swallowed, when the sun died, and the world went cold. But fire remembered us. It stayed. It kept us alive. It is our guardian. Boom! A myth is born. As these stories traveled, they evolved. Some clans worshipped sky god Sto, protect them from another celestial attack. Others revered earth spirits, believing the volcano was alive and had to be appeased. In some places, fire itself became divine, a living entity, a protector, a punisher. This era post-Tobame have sparked the first spiritual symbols carved into cave walls, ritual burials, offering charred bones or tools, moon and sun cycles being tracked with primitive calendars. This wasn't just superstition, it was a way to make sense of trauma. Because when the world turns on you, you either break or you believe. Belief gave them purpose, gave them unity, gave them hope. And those beliefs didn't vanish, they evolved into gods, into legends, into the foundations of every major religion we know today, all seated in a time when the stars vanished and the fire whispered back. When the ash finally settled and skies turned from gray to gold, something inside early humans shifted forever. They'd seen the world end once. They wouldn't sit still and wait for it to happen again. So they started walking. This was more than survival. It was instinct. A primal drive to move, to find, to claim. Toba didn't just kill, it displaced. Water sources had shifted. Hunting grounds were barren. The climate was a roulette wheel drought one year, floods the next. Staying put, that was suicide. So small bands became nomads. And that was the moment we became explorers. It started in Africa. The Rift Valley survivor Sto, tribal, firebound, began following rivers north. They didn't know it, but they were carving the first migration routes in human history. Across the Red Sea, into the Arabian Peninsula, through the Fertile Crescent, down into India, and eventually East Asia. These weren't armies. They were families, clans, groups no bigger than a modern classroom. But every step they took rewrote history. Why migrate now? Why not before Toba? Because pressure creates movement. Toba stripped comfort from the equation. There were no more safe zones, only temporary havens that could disappear with the next cold snap or volcanic tremor. So they moved, constantly adapting, observing, mapping the land with memory. Over time, those maps became stories, and those stories became culture. But migration wasn't just a physical journey. It was a mental evolution. Each new biome tested their creativity. Snow-covered highlands, they built clothes from animal skins. Arid deserts, they tracked stars to navigate. Dense forests, they developed sharper tools, better tracking, tighter teamwork. This is how innovation was born on the move. They met challenges, and they met others. Neanderthals, Denisovans, some clashes, some interbreeding, some alliances. But Homo sapiens kept moving, relentless, curious, fire in their hands, myth in their minds. By 50 years ago, we were everywhere, from Africa to Australia, from the Middle East to the Himalayas, from jungle to tundra. And it all started because a volcano made home impossible. The Great Migration wasn't a choice. It was an instinctive response to catastrophe. But it did something incredible. It turned us into a species without borders. A species that adapts, conquers, transforms. From ashes to everywhere, this is how we became global. Picture this. You've just crossed into a lush new valley. The air's cold, trees thick, game is scarce. Your clan is quiet, watchful. Then, through the mist, you spot another group. But they're not animals, and they're not exactly like you. Broader faces, shorter limbs, eyes that seem familiar but not. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, all walking the earth beside us. Long before we dominated the globe, the human story was crowded. Homo sapiens were just one branch of a much bigger tree. And when that tree was shaken by the Toba cataclysm, it forced the branches to collide. What happened next? Let's break it down. Neanderthals, the cold kings of Europe, built for harsh climates, thick bones, stocky frames, massive brains. They hunted mammoths, lived in caves, used tools, buried their dead. When Homo sapiens began pushing into Europe, the Neanderthals were already there. Some tension? Definitely. But it wasn't all war. We mated. We traded. We learned from each other. Yet, they vanished. Why? Possibly because of their small, isolated populations, slower innovation cycles, a brutal post-Toba climate that hit them harder than us. We were more adaptable, more social, and more resilient. That combination sealed their fate. Denisovans, the ghost people, found mostly in Asia and Siberia. We know little, but our DNA remembers them. They were tough, likely mountain-adapted. And some modern humans, especially in Southeast Asia, Oceania, still carry their genetic legacy. Post-Toba migrations may have fractured their territories. They didn't disappear overnight, but their numbers thinned. Eventually, they faded into mystery, not erased, but absorbed. Homo erectus, the last stand. These were ancient even by Neanderthal standards. Long-distance runners, tool users. They spread across Asia, but by the time of Toba, they were fading. The eruption likely finished what time had already started. Their last known remains? Indonesia, smack near Toba's ground zero. Coincidence? Not likely. So why did Homo sapiens survive when the others didn't? We weren't the strongest, not the biggest, not the oldest, but we were the most adaptive. We formed tighter communities. We shared. We spoke. We believed. We innovated in real time, and that gave us an edge no one else had. Toba was the test. We were the only ones who passed. And here's the wild part: they live on in us. Neanderthal DNA in your immune system. Denisovan genes in your oxygen use at high altitudes. Ancient echoes in your brain, your instincts, your dreams. We didn't just outlive them. We became Themin pieces. Imagine pressing reset on the entire human race. Not metaphorically, literally. Thousands of years ago, the Earth did exactly that, with fire, ash, and silence. And when the dust cleared, only a few thousand of us were left. That's the bottleneck. A moment in history when humanity almost wasn't. Let's talk numbers. Before Toba, the global human population might have been 100, 0 or more. After, possibly as low as 3, 0 to 10, 0 survivors worldwide. That's smaller than a modern high school. Just a few scattered clans, hiding in caves, surviving on shellfish and scraps. A single bad winter could have erased us forever. But it didn't. And here's where things get fascinating. You and I? We're all descended from those survivors. Every human alive today carries the genetic fingerprints of that tiny post-Toba population. It's called a genetic bottleneck, and it leaves a mark like a scar written in DNA. You see it in our low genetic diversity compared to other species. You see it in weird genetic quirks that trace back to small groups isolated by disaster. It's the reason humans are shockingly similar to each other, genetically speaking. And it all points to one narrow escape from extinction. So, how did that change us? First, it unified us. We're all distant cousins connected through the trauma our ancestors survived. Second, it may have accelerated evolution. With fewer individuals, every mutation mattered more. A small group with better memory, better survival instincts, those traits spread fast in tiny populations. Toba didn't just cut down numbers, it refined us, turned raw stone into sharpened edge. Some scientists even suggested help develop traits like enhanced communication, emotional bonding, cooperative hunting and food sharing, complex symbolic thinking, aka storytelling, spirituality, culture. Why? Because after nearly being wiped out, surviving required teamwork like never before. You didn't make it by being the strongest, you made it by being the most connected. Sound familiar? It's the root of why we build communities, form nations, and tell stories today. But here's the darker twist. That bottleneck means a lot of diversity, biological, cultural, even linguistic, was lost forever. Whole lineages, gone. Whole languages, traditions, and knowledge systems wiped out. We are the descendants of survivors, but also the orphans of a much richer human story that never got told. So, next time you feel disconnected, zoom out. Realize this: you're part of a thread that barely made it through the fire. And that thread, it binds all of us. The world had changed, but not just outside. Inside the human mind, something began to shift. It wasn't enough to survive. People needed meaning, a reason to believe tomorrow would come. So they looked to the fire, not just for warmth, but for answers. When the sun disappeared for years, fire became the only light in the dark. And in that flickering glow, ritual was born. They began to sit in circles, not just to eat, but to remember. Stories were whispered, gestures repeated, symbols scratched into cave walls. Not superstition, connection. It wasn't religion yet, but it was the seed. Maybe they spoke to ancestors. Maybe they thanked the sky. Maybe they feared the dark so deeply, they built myths just to cope. They saw shapes in flames. They saw gods in storms. They saw patterns in chaos. And around the fire, humanity became something more than animal. You can almost hear it, the chants, the drumbeats, the silence between them. The start of identity, the birth of culture. Because the real battle wasn't just outside. It was in the mind. And belief was the weapon that helped them win. The skies were finally shifting. Ash settled, winds changed, and the cold loosened its grip. That's when the survivors started to move. They didn't call it migration. They weren't explorers. They were just looking for life. Families drifted out from the caves, carrying fire in one hand and hope in the other. They followed the coast. They followed the rivers. Anywhere food still grew. Anywhere the sky looked less broken. Every new land came with a new threat. Predators, climates, starvation waiting behind the wrong turn. But step by step, they adapted. Clothing from hide. Weapons shaped for new prey. Songs that kept rhythm on the trail. And as they moved, something wild happened. Their brains didn't just survive. They evolved. Faster decisions, better memory. New languages whispered between kin. The world tried to wipe them out. Instead, it made them stronger. Some stayed in Africa. Some reached the Middle East. Some walked all the way to Asia. Not in one year, not in one generation, but always forward. The human wave never stopped. It carried fire, faith, and now legacy. Because once the earth tried to end us, we made it ours instead. They were here long before us. They hunted. They built. They survived the cold and ruled the wild edges of the earth. But today, they're ghosts. We're talking about the other humans. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus. Species with fire in their hands and minds behind their eyes. And one by one, they vanished. Let's start with the most famous, Neanderthals. Stockier, stronger, cold adapted. These folks weren't dumb cavemen, they were survivors. They buried their dead. They made tools. They even wore jewelry made of shells and bones. But when Homo sapiens arrived in Europe and parts of Asia, the balance tipped. For a while, the two species coexisted. Even mingled. Yes, that's right. If you've got non-African ancestry, there's a good chance you're carrying Neanderthal DNA right now. But by around 40 years ago, they were gone. Why? Not genocide. Not a single war. More like a slow erasure. We outnumbered them, outlasted them, and absorbed what was left. Then there were the Denisovans, the mystery humans. We barely know their faces. A few teeth, a bone fragment, some DNA tucked into the high-altitude lungs of modern Tibetans. That's right, they helped us adapt. Before vanishing, they passed on genes for living in extreme cold and thin air. Clues suggest they held out in parts of Siberia, East Asia, maybe even Southeast Asia. But Toba's wrath, that volcanic winter, it likely thinned their numbers just like it did ours. And with Homo sapiens on the move, they didn't stand a chance. And what about Homo erectus? These were the pioneers, the first humans to leave Africa nearly 2 million years ago. But by the time the Toba eruption hit, they were fading out. Their fire was dying. Their tools were stagnant. And when the skies turned black, their final chapters were written. So, what really happened to our cousins? We didn't wipe them out with spears. We beat them with numbers, with language, with culture, with belief. They couldn't adapt fast enough. We could. That's what made the difference. And here's the heavy truth. We didn't just outlive our cousins. We became the last human standing. All the voices, all the tribes, all the unique lines of humanity, boiled down to one surviving thread. Us. Before the ash, the planet was buzzing. Jungles teemed with life. Savannas thundered with megafauna. Birdsong, herds, predators, prey, a rhythm as old as time. And then, silence. Toba didn't just push humans to the edge. It broke the food chain. Ash blanketed forests. Photosynthesis slowed to a crawl. Plants died. Fast. No plants meant no herbivores. No herbivores meant starving predators. It was a cascade collapse. In Asia, majestic beasts like giant elephants and ancient rhinos started vanishing. Big animals need big meals there. Weren't any left. Even insects took a hit. With less plant life, pollinators dropped, which meant fewer fruits, which meant fewer birds. Toba didn't just kill it, unwound ecosystems. In tropical zones, rainforest floors went quiet. The canopy dimmed. Insects, reptiles, small mammals gone. In cooler climates, a different kind of death. With sunlight blocked, ice advanced. Glaciers marched south. What had been habitable became frozen hell. Species that couldn't adapt fast enough froze out or fled. Some migrated only to starve elsewhere. Others, fossilized remnants of a world undone. And don't think marine life was safe. Volcanic gases acidified some waters. Algae blooms collapsed. That's the base of the entire oceanic food web gone. Fish died, coral bleached. The oceans echoed with silence too. But out of this wreckage came selective survival. Small, nimble species had a better shot. Rodents, insects, birds that could migrate quickly. Scavengers who didn't mind what they ate. Nature doesn't mourn. It adapts or erases. That's why the post-Toba world looks so different from what came before. The age of the giants began to end, and the age of the adaptable began. Humans, of course, were part of this. Not predators, not prey. Just observers, caught in the storm. But as animals fell, something wild happened. Humans began to fill the gaps. We started hunting smarter, learning from collapsing ecosystems, taking over abandoned ecological niches. We didn't just survive Toba. We started reshaping Earth and its aftermath. Because when the wild goes quiet, new kings rise. Every one of us carries it. A memory coded in flesh. A whisper from 74,000 years ago, buried in our genes. See, when Toba blew, it didn't just end lives. It squeezed humanity through a genetic funnel. Only a few thousand survived, maybe fewer. The rest? Gone. Entire bloodlines erased. This is what scientists call a bottleneck. A brutal reset that slashes genetic diversity. And it's why modern humans are surprisingly similar, genetically speaking. We all come from the same few clans. The same tiny group huddled in caves, watching the sky burn. That's not just trivia. That's who we are. Our immune systems, shaped by the diseases those survivors faced. Our brains, forged under pressure because survival demanded memory, strategy, and communication. The tribes that cooperated lived. The ones that didn't. So the genes that survived, they weren't just strong. They were smart, social, adaptable. And maybe that's where empathy really took root. You can't make it through years of darkness without trust. Some scientists even think this bottleneck boosted brain development. Forced evolution's hand. More abstract thought. More language complexity. More what-ifs. We didn't just inherit those genes. We inherited their lessons. To fear the dark. To protect the tribe. To seek the sun again, no matter how long it's gone. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just some ancient tragedy. Toba is still in us. In every heartbeat. Every instinct to gather around a fire. To stay close to family. To look up and wonder what's coming next. It's the ultimate twist. Our near extinction may be the reason we became so unstoppable. Because we weren't the biggest. We weren't the strongest. But after Toba, we were the most resilient species this planet had ever seen. And that resilience, it got passed down. Generation by generation. Story by story. Gene by gene. All the way to you. Picture it. The skies still choked with ash. Temperatures plummeting. Food scarce. Predators desperate. And somewhere, on a wind-blasted cliffside, a flicker of fire inside a cave. That flame, that's us. This was the age of the cave clans. Not big civilizations, not villages. Just small, tight-knit groupston. Maybe 30 people at most huddled together for survival. Caves became strongholds. Not just shelter but fortress, nursery, classroom, temple. In those dark spaces, humanity rewired how it lived. Children weren't just raised by parents, they were raised by the group. Knowledge became sacred. How to start a fire. How to track game. How to read the stars, even when they barely shined. These weren't just skills. They were lifelines. The clans that shared knowledge, they endured. The ones that hoarded it, they vanished. Fire wasn't just for heat anymore. It became the center of culture. Stories were told around it, warnings passed down, myths born, and maybe, just maybe, that's where belief began. When the sun disappeared, when crops died, when the earth trembled, humans needed meaning. So we looked at the fire like it was holy. We stared into its dancing light and saw ancestors, gods, fate. That's not superstition. That's survival psychology. Because in the worst of times, hope becomes a weapon. Clans that believed they had purpose, that they were chosen to endure, fought harder, hid smarter, stayed alive longer. And in those caves, the human story changed. Not just surviving, but organizing, dividing labor, assigning roles, building early hierarchies. Someone had to lead. Someone had to guard the fire. Someone had to teach. From the outside, these caves looked like tombs. But inside, they were the womb of civilization. The idea of us was forged here, not just individuals' community. And it wasn't temporary. Even when the skies cleared, we never unlearned it. We carried those behaviors forward. The clan, the story, the sacred flame. That's the legacy of the cave people. Not savagery strategy, not fear foundation. The world ended, and they built the blueprint for the one that came next. When the sun vanished, when days blurred into endless twilight, when thunder wasn't just weather, but omen, something shifted in the human mind. We didn't just survive the Toba winter. We searched for meaning in it. Because when everything is falling apart, logic alone doesn't cut it. We needed something more. A reason to keep going. A story to believe in. A power to beg for mercy. Enter faith. Not temples, not religions with names yet, but raw, primal belief. It started with fire, our only light, our only warmth. A God we could touch, feed, fear, and worship. We danced around it, whispered to it, gave it offerings, bones, leaves, ash. Not because it asked, because we needed it to stay. Because if the fire died, we died. But it didn't stop at fire. The sun, gone. So maybe it was angry, or dead, or stolen. And maybe, just maybe, it would come back if we asked. That's the moment we stepped into myth. We began telling stories of gods beneath the earth, of beasts in the sky, of light that would return if we proved ourselves worthy. These stories weren't bedtime tales. They were instruction manuals for surviving the apocalypse. They taught courage. They taught sacrifice. They gave structure to chaos. In caves from Africa to Indonesia, we find early carvings, spirals, hands, animals, symbols of something more. The need to leave a mark, to be remembered, to speak to something beyond ourselves. And with that, we didn't just endure Toba. We evolved, faith-bound clans together, unified them under shared purpose, gave strength to the weak, and turned despair into action. It also made us dangerous. Because when people believe in something bigger, they fight harder. They take risks. They sacrifice. It's the same force that would one day build pyramids, paint cave walls, and launch rockets. It started here, in the dark, when the world was broken and the fire was all we had. The day the sun disappeared, we lit our own. And from that light, we created the first gods. It wasn't enough to believe. People needed to show it, to act it out, to prove it again and again. Because in a world where nothing made sense, action became anchor. Something you could repeat, control, trust. That's where ritual began. Simple at first. A circle of stones, a chant before sleep, a mark on a wall. But every time it was done, it meant something. To the clan, to the fire, to whatever unseen force they thought was listening. The earliest ceremonies probably weren't called that at all, but they had structure, pattern, symbol. A kill meant more than food, it meant a blessing. So blood was spilled a certain way, bones laid just right, maybe even buried. Not for practicality, but spirituality. You can almost hear the merely humans whispering stories, teaching their children, don't eat before the sun returns, burn this branch before the hunt, touch the wall before you sleep. Was it fear? Sure. But it was also hope. Hope that if they did it right, maybe the sky would open. Maybe the animals would return. Maybe they'd make it another day. And these weren't random acts. They were shared acts. Everyone participated. Everyone remembered. It became identity. You weren't just part of a group. You were part of a ritual system that stretched back generations. Even children took part. They learned the steps, the songs, the marks. And through that process, they became human in a new way. Caves became more than shelter. They were sacred spaces. We find ochre handprints on walls, rows of footprints, bones arranged with care. These were not accidents. They were ceremonies, a way to speak to time itself, to say, we were here, we mattered, we endured. Even death took on new meaning. Instead of leaving bodies for the elements, early humans buried them. Carefully, intentionally, sometimes with tools, beads, or animal parts. That's not just disposal. That's a belief in something after. And once you believe in something after, you begin shaping your present differently. You behave. You honor. You create rules. Ritual turned survival into story. It turned fear into rhythm. And it gave the chaos a heartbeat. Without it, we crumble. With it, we build. You're in a cave. The fire's dying. The child next to you is crying. And your partner just spotted something movement in the dark. What do? Grunt? Point? Or do you do something we now take for granted? You speak. But this wasn't poetry. It wasn't storytelling yet. It was survival. Come here. Stay back. Food there. Danger. Words didn't start as ideas. They started as warnings. Because in a world as brutal as post-Toba Earth, 1 second could mean life or death. And gestures alone weren't cutting it anymore. So humans did what they've always done best. Adapted. They turned emotion into sound. Pain became a cry. Joy became a laugh. Warning became a shout. Then came repetition, pattern, recognition. A sound meant something. Do it enough times, and now it's a word. That's how it started. Not full languages, but proto-language. Basic, raw, but powerful. Picture it, a clan huddled together, trying to signal where the animals migrated, trying to describe the strange light in the sky, trying to pass on the memory of a cave where firewood still grows. You can't do that with silence. So we started building a bridge. Word by word, sound by sound, across generations. And once we had that tool, the world changed. We could teach, plan, warn, dream. The children who grew up with language could learn faster. They could remember more. They could lead better. And just like that, communication became evolutionary advantage. Clans who talked survived. Clans who stayed silent, they vanished with the ash. We find clues of this in fossil skulls. The shape of the throat, The size of the brain's language centers. Toba didn't just force us to adapt, it accelerated us. Our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were beginning to connect. And when words appeared, everything changed. Stories became easier, rituals became deeper, beliefs became movements, and most importantly, humans started dreaming aloud. From survival to speech, from instinct to expression. This wasn't just the rise of language. It was the birth of humanity's voice. After Toba's wrath, the world was chaos. The skies were gray. The land was cracked. Predators roamed freely, and food was scarce. But in the middle of that storm, there was one thing stronger than fear: the clan. These weren't just family units. They were everything: tribe, safety net, identity, and law. If you weren't in a clan, you weren't just alone. You were dead. In a world that nearly ended, togetherness became currency. You had the firekeeper, the hunter, the forager, the storyteller. Every role mattered. Every person counted. If one failed, all suffered. So they learned to function like a single living thing. One heart, one purpose, one mission: survive. And this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust. Who watches while you sleep? Who knows where the last clean water is? Who teaches the child how to make fire or hunt or hide? This level of dependence created a new kind of human bond. Not just blood, 'tis emotional loyalty. And with loyalty came structure. Unspoken rules. Leaders rose not from brute strength, but from wisdom and foresight. Stay near the river. Don't hunt during thunder. Mark the cave entrance. Those who remembered patterns and predicted danger became the first leaders. And the others? They followed because following meant food. Following meant fire. Then came something even more powerful: culture. Inside each clan, you had different stories, different rituals, even different words. That's how identity formed. One clan painted their bodies red. Another buried their dead in circles. One passed down a chant sung only under the stars. These weren't just traditions, they were flags. Markers of who you were and who you weren't. Conflict probably sparked from this too. Clans clashed over territory, over resources, over belief. But just as often, they traded, shared, merged. Two clans might meet, teach each other a word, a dance, a hunting trick, and suddenly something new was born. Connection. This was the beginning of society. We didn't leap from caves to cities. We started in clans. And through fire, fear, and faith, we built community. Not out of luxury, not out of peace, but out of raw, desperate need. And that's what made it unbreakable. The clan wasn't just a group. It was the first seed of civilization. Everything we are, now villages, towns, nations, ideologies, all of it started with a small circle of people around a dying fire, refusing to die with it. They ruled the land like living legends: towering elephants, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths the size of minivans. The megafauna Earth's prehistoric heavyweights were the kings of their ecosystems. But when Toba erupted, not even giants could stand tall. The blast itself was brutal. Shockwaves, firestorms, rains of ash thicker than any blizzard. But that wasn't what ended them. It was what came after. The skies didn't clear. The sun stayed hidden. And slowly, their world began to starve. These massive creatures needed massive amounts of food. Grasslands turned to ash fields. Forests collapsed under acidic rain and freezing winds. Plants died. The herbivores followed, and behind them, the predators starving, desperate, doomed. Picture a herd of giant elephants, migrating hundreds of miles, searching for grass that no longer exists. Their bones now lie buried beneath layers of ash and silence. Some fought, others fled. But the truth was brutal. Size became a curse. The bigger you were, the more you needed. And Earth post-Toba had nothing left to give. From Indonesia to Africa, ancient megafauna faced the same fate. Extinction swept through them like a second volcanic wave. Giant rhinoceroses, woolly mammoths, cave lions, gone, or left in numbers too small to last. And with every lost species, the food chain cracked. Predator-prey relationships unraveled. Whole ecosystems collapsed. This wasn't just the end of big animals. It was the beginning of a smaller, faster world. Humans, by comparison, needed little. They adapted. They shifted diets, moved inland or coastal, leaned into fire, strategy, and tools. But megafauna? They couldn't change fast enough. Even the oceans weren't safe. With coastline shifting and marine life disrupted, some aquatic giants faced their own slow decline. The world was downsizing, and nature wasn't being kind about it. This extinction reshaped Earth's balance. It cleared space for new life, new behavior, and most importantly, us. Because with giants gone, humans rose. We became top predators, not by muscle, but by mind. Not by force, but by fire and foresight. Toba didn't just remove species. It removed competition. It opened the door for humanity to walk through scarred, but standing. We didn't conquer the giants. We outlived them. You're huddled in a cave. The sky hasn't turned blue in years. The air tastes like smoke and fear. Every sound outside might be death. And yet, in that darkness, a question burns hotter than the fire. Why? That single question sparked something no volcano could kill. Belief. Toba didn't just scorch the earth. It shook the human spirit to its core. And when the ground stops shaking, the silence gets loud. We weren't just surviving. We were searching. For meaning. For answers. For something bigger than the cold and hunger. That's when rituals began. It may have started with a body buried, not just left to rot. Or a rock arranged just so. A fire lit at dusk, not for heat, but for hope. People began to mark moments. Birth, death, the first hunt, the longest night. Symbols scratched into cave walls, ash rubbed into skin. Whispers around the fire about the sun's return or the spirit in the wind. These weren't just habits. They were the first spiritual sparks. Because when reality collapses, mythology rises. Maybe they believed the sky god was angry. Maybe the smoke was a sign. Maybe the fire needed feeding not with wood, but with faith. And once one clan believed, others followed. It spread, like fire from one torch to the next. Not all beliefs were the same, of course. Some worshipped the sun, desperate for it to rise again. Others feared it. Some carved symbols into bones. Others danced in circles, chanting to unseen forces. But the core was the same. There must be more to this than pain. And in a world where survival was everything, belief became its own kind of weapon. It gave people strength when food didn't. It gave them purpose when everything else crumbled. It gave them rules, leaders, stories. And stories are immortal. Some of these early spiritual systems were passed down. Whispers turned into legends. Legends turned into traditions. Traditions became the roots of modern religions. Yes, right here, In the cold and ash of post-Toba Earth, we might be staring at the birth of human faith. Not blind belief, but belief born from trauma, carried by hope. We survived the eruption. But it was this spark, the one you can't see or measure, that truly kept the flame alive. In a world where every sunrise felt like a miracle, fire wasn't just survival, it was sacred. It warmed the caves. It cooked the food. It kept predators at bay. But most importantly, it became the keeper of stories. Every clan had honor a few. The Firekeeper. This wasn't just someone good with flint. This was someone who stayed up through the darkest nights. Someone who guarded flame like others guarded children. Because without fire, there was no life. But fire was more than flame. It became a symbol for memory, tradition, wisdom. Enter the knowledge carriers. In the aftermath of Toba, the world wasn't just physically shattered. Oral memory, the way humans passed, knowledge was dangling by a thread. Hunting techniques, herbal remedies, star patterns, warnings about dangerous zones, stories about how the world nearly ended. The ones who remembered became everything. They weren't kings. They weren't warriors. They were the ones who could say, "I remember where the fish still bite. My mother taught me how to store roots underground. There's a cave west of the river that stays warm through winter." Their minds were libraries. Their mouths were vaults. And around every fire, children would sit in silent awe, absorbing the blueprint of survival. We're not talking about written language yet. Not symbols on stone, but rhythm, ritual, repetition. That's how you pass down knowledge in a world where there's no paper, no pen, only time and tongues. And over generations, these firekeepers and knowledge carriers became the seeds of what we'd one day call culture. They passed on more than just tactics. They passed on meaning, what it meant to be human, what it meant to lose, to love, to fight, to forgive. These were the first teachers, the first historians, the first guardians of everything we'd one day build upon. And without them, we'd all be walking into the same dark caves over and over again, blind, cold, and lost. We survived the eruption. We built belief in the smoke. And with fire in our hands and stories in our hearts, we started building a future. The world was still wounded. Ash lay thick on the land, and skies remained gray. But deep inside the caves, something magical was happening. Not hunting, not hiding, creating. The first flickers of human imagination began to paint the darkness. Literally. Blombo's cave, Chauvet, Lascaux. These weren't just shelters. They were canvases. Walls came alive with ochre-red animals. Stick-figured men chased wild beasts. Handprints raw. Primal signatures stamped a message across time. We were here, and we mattered. This wasn't about decoration. It was about remembrance. Those drawings captured hunts that fed a clan, storms that nearly wiped them out. The shapes of the sun, the moon, and fire, always fire. Some researchers say it started as communication, a warning, a lesson. Others say it was spiritual, a form of worship. And some say it was just human. The urge to leave a mark, to say, this is who we are, even when no one's watching. Think about it. They were painting in pitch-black caves, miles from sunlight. They didn't even know if those walls would last. But they still did it. Because deep down, something had changed in our species. We were no longer just surviving. We were starting to understand ourselves. Art wasn't just a pastime. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, early humans saw more than animals and fire. They saw stories, myths, maybe even the first gods. And when children gathered around the fire, those walls spoke louder than any voice. They said, "Here's where the mammoths roamed. Here's what saved us. Here's the danger to avoid." They became living textbooks, told in color, shape, and symbol. No grammar, no punctuation, just raw, human soul poured onto stone. And this was the moment when instinct began evolving into identity. From grunts and gestures, to paint, pattern, and purpose. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were feeling, fearing, hoping. That spark of expression would become the foundation of everything. Poetry, religion, philosophy, science. It all started here, with pigment pressed against stone in the belly of the earth. From the ashes of destruction, humanity found its voice, not in words, but in images that would outlive even the hands that made them. And if you're wondering whether these ancient artists knew how powerful they were, they didn't need to, because when the torchlight danced across those painted walls, they saw something bigger than fear. They saw themselves. Something strange started happening in the shadows of prehistoric caves and cliffside shelters. Humans stopped just reacting to the world. They began interpreting it. A pile of stones wasn't just a pile. A red handprint wasn't just a decoration. It meant something. We had crossed an invisible threshold. Not just seeing, but believing. Suddenly, death wasn't the end. Storms weren't random. The hunt wasn't just for meat, it had to be honored. Across Africa, Asia, and Europe, ancient humans began performing rituals. Burials with red ochre smeared on bodies. Animal bones arranged with precision. Tools placed beside the dead. Not by accident, not practical. These were offerings, symbols, proof of something deeper stirring inside the mind. Was it fear? Was it love? Was it awe? Maybe all three. These early rituals weren't just customs. They were how we began to control the chaos. The world was wild. One bad storm, one failed hunt, and your entire clan could vanish. So what did humans do? They told stories, created symbols, worshipped fire, invented spirits, gods, ancestors, anything that made the unknown feel a little less terrifying. You can almost picture it. A circle of people around a fire. The oldest among them begins to speak. Not facts, but myths. A tale about the sky spirit who stole the sun. A warning about the cursed river that swallowed a hunter. A chant to keep predators away at night. And when the fire flickered and the cave echoed with breathless silence, something inside each person changed. These rituals weren't just ceremony. They were connection. To the past. To each other. To something greater. This is where symbolism was born. A feather could mean Flytor, a fallen soul. A carved stone could represent the Mooner, a memory. Words weren't needed. Meaning pulsed through every motion, every mark, every myth. Even silence had its own sacred rhythm. These moments bound clans together, turned strangers into tribes, gave birth to culture. Because when people believe in the same thing, even if it's invisible, they become unstoppable. It was this shift from instinct to imagination, from reaction to ritual, that carved the foundation of humanity's future. Without it, there would be no religion, no storytelling, no law, no unity, just scattered, silent survivors. But because we started assigning meaning to the meaningless, we made the world speak back to us. And it all started with a whisper in the dark, a hand reaching into the unknown and pulling out belief. Before gods had names, before temples were built, before myths had heroes, there was fire. It didn't just warm us, it transformed us. To early humans, fire wasn't a tool, it was divine. It danced, it roared, it destroyed, it protected. It was unpredictable, alive, and mesmerizing. You couldn't hold it, but it could hold your entire world together. Picture this: a freezing night. The wind howls through the dark. Predators circle just beyond the tree line. And in the center of a stone circle fire, crackling, burning, breathing, the clan gathers close, not just for warmth, but for hope. Fire meant life. It meant survival. It meant power. Over time, something shifted in how humans saw it. They began to treat it differently. No longer just feeding it sticks. They fed it rituals. They built hearths like altars. They protected the flame like a sacred child. Some tribes even carried embers with them during migration, never letting it die. Because if the fire died, they believed they would too. To those who lived in endless shadow after the Toba eruption, fire wasn't just warmth. It was the return of the sun. It lit up the world when the real sun disappeared. It cooked food when everything raw was poison. It drove away beasts that had no fear of men, but feared the flame. So what did humans do? They worshipped it. They danced around it. They sang to it. They offered it bones, food, even whispered prayers. And slowly, fire became more than survival. It became spiritual. In the stories told around the flame, fire became a character, a hero, a god, the bringer of light, the punisher of evil, the guardian of home. Even today, echoes of that reverence remain. Hindu rituals still feed fire as a living presence. Zoroastrian temples keep sacred flames burning eternally. Olympic torches are carried like ancient relics. Why? Because deep in our DNA, fire still whispers the same truth it did 74,000 years ago. I kept you alive. It's no coincidence that fire sparked language, community, and imagination. It gave us nights without fear, meals with meaning, and stories that lasted longer than stone. So the next time you light a match or sit by a campfire, know this: you're staring into humanity's first god, long before books, before alphabets, before even spoken language as we know it. There were marks, scratches, swirls, handprints smeared in ochre. And they weren't random. They were humanity's first whispers to the universe. Picture a dark cave. Outside chaos, ice, ash, predators. Inside silence, stillness, a fire flickers. And there, on the wall, a crimson handprint. Pressed, held, left behind. That wasn't decoration. That was a claim. I was here. I survived. I matter. After the Toba eruption, early humans scattered into caves, cliffs, and overhangs looking for shelter. But they didn't just hide. They expressed. They began to record. And what they created wasn't just practical, it was profound. Charcoal outlines of animals: buffalo, mammoths, antelope. Not just creatures they hunted, but symbols of power, spirit, and connection. They traced circles, spirals, and dots. Repeated patterns that mirrored cosmic rhythms, moon cycles, and seasonal migrations. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were remembering, imagining, believing. The Blombos Cave in South Africa holds some of the oldest known human artifacts: engraved ochre blocks, shell beads, and geometric carvings from nearly 75,000 years ago. That's not survival gear. That's identity. It's the birth of culture. You see, when humans began marking stone, they weren't just decorating, they were crossing a threshold. From instinct to meaning, from reaction to creation. That leap changes everything. Because once you create symbols, you can tell stories. And once you tell stories, you shape reality. The walls of those ancient caves weren't just art galleries. They were temples, classrooms, memory banks, places where generations came to understand themselves and each other. That's where myths were born, where ancestors became sacred, where survival became legacy. And here's the wild part. Those same marks are echoed today, in graffiti on concrete walls, in tattoos across skin, in logos that define tribes not by blood, but belief. It all started in the shadows of catastrophe, when the world was frozen, and a human picked up a piece of red ochre and said, "This will outlive me." And it did. Before words, there was rhythm. Before stories, there was sound. And when the world was drowning in silence after Toba's wrath, humans broke that silence not with speech, but with music. Picture this: a cold wind howling outside the cave, ash still falling like ghost snow. Inside, a circle of survivors. One of them picks up a hollow bird bone and blows. A low, haunting note echoes off the cave walls. It wasn't just noise. It was feeling. It was connection. The first bone flutes, found in Europe and dated over 40 years old, weren't toys. They were tools of memory. Each note carried a moment. A death, a birth, a hunt, a storm. And then came the drum animal skins stretched over hollow logs, pounded in rhythm with the heart. Drums weren't just music. They were commands, calls to action, and rites of passage. Sound became ceremony. Rhythm became communication. Beats became beliefs. Every tap echoed deeper than the ear could hear it, vibrated in the soul. In some tribes, drumming mimicked thunder inviting the storm gods. In others, flute songs lulled children to sleep, keeping trauma at bay through lullabies. And in war, the beat bound the tribe pulsing like one heartbeat, charging into the unknown. Music was medicine. It was the antidote to terror, the signal that we're still here. And sound, unlike speech, didn't need translation. A beat is universal. A melody travels across clans, regions, even species. Birds sing. Wolves howl. But only humans composed. When they played, they weren't just entertaining, they were processing, turning suffering into art, turning isolation into rhythm. And soon, they began to pair sound with story. Drum beats beneath chants, flutes behind tales of fire gods and ancestors. It was storytelling with an emotional signature. You didn't just hear the tale, you felt it. In these ancient gatherings, around flame and ash, our ancestors laid the foundation for everything we do. Today, concerts, speeches, ceremonies, even podcasts. Because when humans learned to create music, they learned to control mood. And in a world that had nearly ended, that power was priceless. Before kings ruled and priests preached, there was one role that held the tribe together: the firekeeper. When the world froze after Toba's fury, when the nights stretched longer than the days, when warmth meant life, one person was trusted with the most sacred job: keeping the flame alive. It wasn't just a campfire. It was survival, spirit, and symbol. This fire was never allowed to die. Not for a second. Because if the flame vanished, so did hope. And that's where mythology was born. Across cultures, fire became more than light and heat. It became divine, a gift from gods, or stolen by tricksters, guarded by spirits, passed down through generations like a holy relic. The Greeks had Prometheus. The Hindus had Agni. The Zoroastrians built eternal flames. The Aboriginal Australians believed fire was stolen from the sun by ancestral beings, all echoing one primal truth. Fire wasn't just made, it was earned, and it had to be protected. Firekeepers were the first shamans, the original guardians. They sat awake while others slept. They whispered chants into the embers. They taught children to bow before the flaminot out of fear, but reverence. Because that fire told a story. We made it through the dark. We survived the storm. We are still here. And around that fire, the tribe found more than warmth. They found identity. Fire became the center of every ritual. It lit up the first funerals. It blessed births. It sealed alliances between clans. It became the theater for legends and lullabies. The hearth wasn't just in the center of the shelter. It was the center of the human story. Even the way we speak today carries echoes of that legacy. We talk about rekindling relationships. We say people have a spark. We speak of burning passion or fiery tempers. We've never stopped worshiping the flame, and maybe we never will. Because in a world once buried under volcanic ash and silence, fire spoke back. It crackled, it danced, it warmed, it warned. And it never forgot us. Picture this. A child crouched low in a cave, torchlight flickering behind them, hands stained with red ochre. And on the wall, in front shapes, emerge animals, spirits, chaos, fire, stars, ash. This wasn't art for art's sake. This was survival, memory, and magic. After the Toba catastrophe, words weren't enough. So early humans turned to walls. Caves became cathedrals. Across South Africa, France, Indonesia, even Australia, we find the same thing. Cave paintings exploding with emotion. Buffalo charging. Hands pressed like signatures of the forgotten. Swirls of smoke. Beasts. And what might be suns fading or returning. To the modern eye, it's prehistoric graffiti. But to them, it was a message to the future. We lived through something. This happened. We remember. These weren't just depictions of hunts or animals, they were visual prayers. Attempts to make sense of a sky that went dark. To honor the creatures that vanished. To tell the next generation, this is who we were, and what we survived. And here's the kicker: these paintings show up right after the volcanic winter. It's like trauma-triggered creativity. Grief unlocked expression. And out of that, culture was born. No one told them to do it. No one taught them art theory. They just had to. The same way we write songs after heartbreak or journal through pain. And think about the environment they were in. Cold, scarce, harsh. They could have spent every ounce of energy on food and fire. But they still made time to paint. Because storytelling wasn't optional. It was essential. Inside those caves, surrounded by shadows and silence, they didn't just record history, they transformed it. They turned ash into symbolism, fear into folklore, and their own hands into living stamps that said, "We were here, we mattered." And maybe that's the root of all storytelling, a desperate, defiant act against extinction. So next time you see a cave painting, don't just look at the shape. Look at the intention. Behind every line is a survivor. Behind every handprint, a story we'll never fully grasp but deeply feel. The sun disappeared. The skies turned to ash. The world cracked open. And when it came back, humans didn't just rebuild their homes. They rebuilt meaning. What do you do when the sky betrays you? You don't forget. You turn it into myth. Across the world, long after the last ash settled, stories started to emerge. Stories about a flood that wiped everything out. Stories about gods punishing mankind with darkness. Stories about fire being stolen from the heavens to save humanity. Coincidence? Not likely. Toba left scars not just in soil, but in memory. Imagine you're the grandchild of a volcanic winter survivor. You've heard the whispers, the tale of the long night, the day the warmth disappeared, the people who died because the sky went black. You grow up believing the sun itself can die. You invent reasons. You build narratives. And that's how myths are born. In Norse legends, it was the Fimbulwinter 3 years of cold before the gods fell. In Hindu cycles, it's Kali Yuga, an age of darkness followed by rebirth. In Aboriginal Australian lore, spirits covered the sun in revenge. In Egypt, the sun god Ra vanished into the underworld nightly, only to fight back toward dawn. Different continents. Same fear. A global wound carved a shared archetype. The world ends, but something survives. Something begins again. It wasn't just stories to scare children. It was how humans processed what they couldn't explain. Fire became divine. The sun became sacred. Darkness became symbolic of judgmental transformation. And here's the wild part. These myths kept evolving, passed down by campfires, etched into stone, retold in temples, until one day they became religion. The Toba event may be the deepest root of humanity's spiritual instinct. Not to worship out of gratitude, but out of fear. Fear that it could all vanish again, but also hope because the myths didn't end in ruin. They ended in rebirth. The sun returns. The gods forgive. A hero rises. That's the legacy of survival. We don't just remember the pain. We turn it into prophecy, poetry, power. And if myth was the first version of history, then the Toba eruption was our genesis. They say pressure makes diamonds, but sometimes it makes civilizations. The Toba eruption didn't just test humanity, it rewired us. Before the ash, we were scattered tribes, hunting and gathering. After the ash, we became something else. Something more. Tactical, tribal, tied together. See, when survival depends on more than muscle, something has to step in. Mind, memory, meaning, and fire. Fire became the centerpiece of everything. Imagine those early survivors, huddled in volcanic caves, not just for warmth, but for identity. The flames lit their stories, their fears, their futures. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were creating. Creating language not just for tools and threats, but for feelings. Creating rituals not just for hunting, but for healing. Creating art not just for beauty, but to make sense of it all. And that shift, it didn't die when the skies cleared. It stuck. That's why ancient civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley all had fire at the center of their rituals. It wasn't random. It was genetic memory. That's why storytelling exploded. Because memory alone wasn't enough, we had to transfer it. Keep the knowledge, pass the warnings. Don't forget the darkness. That's why we started to build together. Clans became communities. Communities became tribes. Tribes became culture. Toba taught us that isolation is extinction. That safety isn't in strength, it's in systems. Who controls the fire, controls the future. And here's the kicker. You can still feel it in us today. Our obsession with light, our fear of silence, our urge to gather around warmth, whether it's a campfire or a screen. Toba didn't end us. It focused us. It gave humanity a crash course in endurance, empathy, and evolution. It didn't just bottleneck our DNA, it concentrated our ingenuity. So when people say, Civilization began with farming or cities. Now go deeper. Civilization began with crisis. And Toba was the ultimate trial. The eruption took our old world, but in the ashes, it left us the tools to build a new one. Fire, language, story, memory. That's the real legacy. There was a time when everything almost ended. Not just for a tribe, not just for a continent. For the entire human species, the sky went dark. The air turned poison. The earth shook and the sun vanished. The Toba supervolcano wasn't just an eruption. It was a reset button on humanity. And yet, here you are, alive, breathing, scrolling through a screen on a rock that almost lost its people. That's not chance. That's legacy. See, our ancestors didn't survive through strength. They weren't the biggest. They weren't the fastest. They were the ones who adapted, who clung to fire, who held each other through the darkness. They formed clans. They whispered stories. They remembered. Toba left scars in the land, in our DNA, in our deepest fears. But it also left something powerful. The drive to rebuild. The instinct to connect. The obsession with meaning. From the blackened skies rose a species that would shape the stars. The next time you hear thunder, the next time a blackout hits and you're reaching for a flashlight, remember, that instinct, that anxiety, that rush of survival, it's not modern, it's prehistoric. It's in you. Toba didn't destroy us. It defined us. Every myth of a great flood, every ancient story of fire and gods and apocalypse, they aren't just tales. They're warnings, whispers from 0 years ago, when the earth reminded us who's boss. But we endured, not by fighting nature but by understanding it, not by hoarding but by sharing, not with hate but with hope. And now, we carry the flame. We tell the story. Because stories are survival, and you are part of it now. This wasn't just history. This was our origin story, a cosmic close call that carved humanity into what it is today. So light a candle, tell a friend, never forget. There was a day the sun disappeared. Humanity didn't survive through strength, but through fire, faith, and each other. From the ashes of extinction, a new species was born. Us. That's the end of the saga. But the conversation isn't over. If this hit, you drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to know their roots, and subscribe to keep exploring the moments that made us. Humanity rose from the fire once. Let's make sure we never forget how.